Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Ozcast.
Okay, Rach, are you ready to go?
Yes.
What are we doing?
I don't know. I thought you knew.
No, aren't you supposed to be running the show? Which guest have we got?
Don't make me the boss of stuff.
You're the boss of stuff.
Let's wing it.
And go.
Hi, welcome to the This Is My Voice podcast.
The podcast where we discuss all things voice performance and talk to some of the industry's best and brightest talent.
We're your hosts, Rachel Salas
and Eddie Bye.
Now, our next guest is very unique. He's a narrator for films such as George of the Jungle and The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle. He's an animation historian and has voiced characters in Blinky Bill and the legendary Bullwinkle J Moose. He's one of Australia's biggest voiceover actors today, Mr. Keith Scott. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Keith.
It's a pleasure, Rachel.
So you're from Sydney, Australia. Tell us about your early years before voiceover acting.
Well, I was just middle-class kid brought up in the first generation of TV people, you know. TV came to Australia in the 50s, which was my earliest decade. By the end of that decade, I was watching cartoons and also I knew I was one of these oddball kids who didn't like sport and so on. So I was just never going to fit in. So I had all these interests like wanting to be an animator because I used to copy cartoon characters off on butcher paper, you know, learn how to draw that way out of old comic books. And then once I really started watching the first ever, you know, black and white TV, the old American cartoons like, Huckleberry Hound and Yogi Bear and all of that. And for some reason, I don't even know why to this day, I was like 6 or 7. I was just drawn to imitate all these voices on there. And it became just this ongoing thing. But by the time I was in my teens, I wanted to write to all of these actors whose names I saw in the credits, because TV cartoons were the first time actors got a credit on screen. You know, the old theatrical ones I write about in that book, they were all anonymous. So were session singers, like narrators of movies and so on. You never heard who these off-screen voices were. And again, that became an obsession with me. So I don't even know what triggered all of this in me, but that was, you know, this Sherlock Holmes sort of thing that became a life study. And I was blessed to realize, you know, back in the 90s, after I'd been at this doing, you know, making a good living doing voiceover work, I was blessed as one of these people whose hobby was my work and whose work was my hobby, you know. I suppose people used to think I was a bit eccentric because I wasn't into all of the normal stuff, and I was into this strange area. Of course, a lot of people would say, that guy's weird. He's into all this cartoons and old movie stars and that sort of thing. Once I think you're hooked on something like that, no matter what your hobby is, you know, it does remain a lifelong thing. So.
You absolutely find your tribe with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
You know, voiceover people, we are all anonymous, right? And that's what I quite like about it. So someone like yourself, you can walk down to the shop, grab a pie, and nobody knows who you are. Whereas when you're a movie star, you know, people sort of do know who you are because they see your face. And I think there's some magic in that. You know, I work with the greatest voice artists in the country, and yet they could just walk down the street and no one would know who they are. People like Robbie McGregor and things like that, you know, like classic voiceover artists. And I actually quite like that. Do you think voiceover people have a personality where they love what they do, but they also love the total anonymity?
The anonymity, yeah. I know
anonymity of it, yeah.
No, I think that sums it up perfectly because, you know, I've known a ton of them over the last 40 years, the voiceover industry. And there was not one of them who, in the area of, I guess, the biggest percentages, commercials, say, nobody cared anything about being known as the voice of this, that, or the other. They loved the anonymity and also the fact that they were still able to be in an industry where they were allowed to perform, and mostly in voiceovers, you're thrown in the deep end when you're very young, because one of the things is you're expected to be creative along with the team producing the stuff, and put your in. But maybe if I tried it this way, that old thing. And often, if you're really good in that sense, and you've done a performance that's become recognized by the public, that'll generate more work anyway, because suddenly you're not only reliable, you're also helpful. Again, being totally anonymous, you can have that life of privacy. So you're in showbiz, but you're not in the show part.
And do you think that's what, in the early days, in the 50s, voiceovers were never credited? Do you think that was part of that was the culture back then, or?
It probably was more the Hollywood movie culture, because it was only the ones in the theatre cartoons that weren't credited. The union over there, the Screen Actors Guild, finally passed some law in the 50s, and when they started making cartoons for television, which was an offshoot of the other medium before visuals, which was radio, drama and comedy, already by 1950 they had a law where supporting actors did get radio credit. And when television came in, you saw on the old Hanna-Barbera cartoons like the Flintstones and that, it said voices Alan Reed, Mel Blanc and all these people who did Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble. So suddenly you knew that actors were doing it. But in the theatre cartoons, I think it was because in the early days of Hollywood, when sound first came in, this sounds awful, but it's like it was a policy not to credit any off-screen voices. At the end of the day, they'd use all sorts of excuses like, it might spoil the illusion and take people's mind off if we said there was an off-screen voice. What it really boiled down to is they were scared that if they got credit, they were going to ask for more money. So, it was... That was early Hollywood, and it was always a cost-saving thing.
Well, there it is. That's the reason. There you go. Sorry, I just wanted to ask that.
No, it was a good question.
Go.
It kind of ties into my next question. So you've written a few books on animation throughout history, including Cartoon Voices of the Golden Age, Part 1 and Part 2. You also mentioned that these books took years to write due to trying to sift and exhume archives to credit many voice performances that weren't originally credited. Can you tell us why one of the most undocumented areas of film history is such an important story to tell?
Yeah, I guess the reason is that these old vintage cartoons and movies have come back now because of the invention of YouTube and other platforms. And now you get, two younger generations who've never seen this stuff before, and some of them finding it really cool stuff. Anything from the old Laurel and Hardy comedies to the Marx Brothers, to stuff that you just don't tend to see in the 21st century because of all of the reality era that we live in now. And so for those people who love that sort of old showbiz, they start asking questions like, who's doing these voices and all. So I could see that coming once cable TV hit, and we ended up with 3,000 TV channels. And I wanted to document it just because it's an industry that I love, and I used to know some of those guys who never got credit. They're long gone now, of course, because I'm ancient myself, but, I'm talking like people like Dawes Butler, who was a legendary voice artist in the US. He came up with the voice of Yogi Bear, Mr. Ranger, sir, and all of those great Hanna-Barbera characters, or Mel Blanc, who was the great voice of Looney Tunes, yeah, what's up, Doc, and all of those great characters, so I knew these guys. I sought them out as a teenager. I wrote letters to them, not expecting to get any answers, and all of them couldn't have been nicer. They sent much longer letters than I expected, and so I was learning from the masters, I guess you could say, in those days, because I call them the masters because they were the first generation since sound came to films, so they were the first ever what I call voice specialists, and it became almost like pay a tribute to these people. I knew them all for about the last 20 years of their lives, and they taught me all sorts of things about voice acting and all the secrets that they'd learned, so this was like a pilgrimage in a way, and it's something I never knew would happen. It just was one of those weird things, the way life takes you. I didn't go planning this, but it just I got to know these people much better than I thought I would, and they fascinated me to the end of their lives. They started in the medium of radio when it was a dramatic and comic medium. It wasn't like modern radio at all. And because they were known as specialists in that area, they could do all sorts of accents and character creations. they got so much, and that branched off into doing the animation work. So that, one industry fed the other in Hollywood, for instance.
Yeah, that kind of led into my next question about if you could tell us a brief history of the industry of voice performance.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
And you've done a bit of that already, but how do you think it's shaped nowadays?
Oh, it's bigger than ever, and it's now a gigantic industry. Again, I think the advent of the internet, opened the field up to so many people who probably would have had a fantasy throughout their life. Oh, I wish I could have done voices. And now it's given that opportunity. So it's gone beyond just cartoons and commercials, which was my main 30 years. That was all that we ever did in those days, where we only had radio, TV. Now you've got offshoots that are huge, like the whole Audible book industry. There's the gaming that was never a thing before, and that's now got a lot of people who are making their living off just the video games industry and so on. And there are still specialists who they call on just for the field of animation, but even that's exploded now with the computer. Where independent animation and computer animation have been added to the mix, I guess you'd say. So, the field has exploded. But just to quickly answer the historical question, it started so strangely because in the early days, none of these animators for the first 10 years knew what they were doing. They were learning every day. So for the first 5 years of sound, most of the voices were done just by the animation staff themselves. There was no concept of hiring freelance actors, except the cartoons evolved and became more sophisticated as they learned more tricks. So you'd get then, later on, more witty cartoons and jokes, and they started calling on radio comedians to come in. So that's where the old idea of hiring specialty talent for animation came from. But really, the first few years were just little animated animals squeaking and grunting, and that was mostly done by staff members. So it's just, like everything, it's just this progression and this evolution of things that just seem mysterious until you look at it back now and think, yeah, now it makes sense how it all just developed. It was like they were learning as they went. Everything is very homogenized these days. I don't know how that happened, but it's just, again, I think we're just living through a period of history that will make sense in a few years, because I was involved in a radio thing here in Sydney it was 33 years it ran, which is a record, called How Green Was My Cactus. And it was...
Oh, really? Sorry, I'll stop you there. I grew up on that as well. Were you in that as well?
Oh, yeah, I was all the political impressions right up to the end. Right up at the end there when the writer retired in 2019, I think it was. But we started in 86, so I was imitating every prime minister, every British and American president and all this. And right up at the end there was just like 2 years into Trump's presidency. So I was doing Donald Trump and, doing all of this sort of stuff, like having the most tremendous, and I just wish it was still around now because, Biden as well. It's scary. In a way, there's a young generation of actors coming up who never practice the way I used to practice. I was probably obsessive, but I used to practice every impression and every dialect I could just so that I would have a gigantic range. I think there's a lot of actors coming up who potentially could have a gigantic range, but they just don't know where to start listening unless they're imitating something on that's very contemporary. That's why you see so many Trump impressions, for instance, because somebody who's that distinctive, the art of it still exists, but there's just no area for it to be seen or heard anymore on radio or television.
To be a voiceover person, you need to have a good ear. You need to be able to listen to what other people are doing, and you need to sort of dissect it, pull it apart, look at the framework of how people are talking and that sort of thing. And I tell my students, find someone who's like you and copy them. I said, you'll always sound like you. You'll never be plagiarizing somebody else's work. But what you're listening for is when they breathe, how fast they talk, and all that sort of thing. And that's just generic, everyday voiceovers, right? Now, I can teach that because I know that stuff. But I think it takes someone with that next level to go, I'm going to sound like a duck, or I'm going to sound like a politician, or I'm going to sound like a Russian person or something like that. And I think it's a skill set that I just do not have, unfortunately. I wish I did, because I love my voice, but I think, I just can't do that. And so don't you think, I worry that, because in all honesty, in Australia, there's probably 10 of you left, don't you think? Yeah, and I worry about that.
Well, the number is dwindling, and it's sort of like the old thing of vaudeville acts who could do amazing things, but they say it's a dying thing. It's like a dying art form. It's like, I still think it exists, but it's just there's no call for it these days because everyone's kind of walking on eggs about the way things are going, and so I can do, like, if it's an English accent, most of the things I'll do now, if I'm doing an Aldi radio commercial, it might be just, one of those very educated, sort of professorial types of voices. But it's kind of a character voice, but it's almost taken as a straight voice these days, saying Aldi, good, different, like that. And so you don't get the chance anymore. But boy, when I started and there was no internet, they would get people like myself and Jim Pike and Dave Gibson and people like that to, once they heard our demo tapes, they'd write commercials based on what we could do, And so there was all this wild and zany stuff on radio commercials, crazy scenarios. They were like little 30-second, where you'd have a crazy French Inspector Clouseau situation and a real tough sort of villain voice like that, would be the conflict. So we just kind of lived for about 20 golden years. There was you'd end up doing 4 sessions a day every day of the week, and you'd walk in not even knowing what character you were going to be. They'd hand you the script, and so you became expert at instant interpretation. And plus, most of us who were really good at that also did tread the boards in comedy clubs and things. So we had that thing feeding it as well. I think one thing fed the other. My impressions became better for years of doing voiceovers from wearing headphones and being able to monitor what I was doing and correct things. And also my voiceover work became better because of my comedy training, where my timing helped the funny scripts and so on. So I really do think each of those things is a big help in this industry too,
Actually, but let me go back to Audi quickly. So when you walk into that session, are they saying we want this, or are they just letting you fly and have a play, or how does that work?
If I read it and I can tell just from the words that it's going to be in the comedy vein, but very subtle sort of out there sort of stuff about, did I just hear what I just heard? That sort of thing. I'll ask them straight away, do you hear anything? And they say, no, just see what comes out, and they'll leave it to me. Or on the other hand, I did do something recently. I can't even think what it was, but it was where they just wanted a couple of old movie voices just saying one line each. So that's specific. Then they just said, no, we heard this guy as Schwarzenegger in The Terminator, like, I'll be back, that sort of thing. And so that was a specific request, Sometimes I'll throw in if they said it was a very cold, villainous type of character, whoever's in the thing at the moment in actors. Years ago, I might do, one of those old movie actors like Humphrey Bogart. These days, it might be a villain with a scary voice like Alan Rickman, where he was in the Die Hard, Yes, your American culture, John Wayne, Roy Rogers. Yeah, I was kind of always partial to Roy Rogers myself, Hans. So having practiced all these voices for years and years, they're sort of like in a compartment in my brain, and I might not have done an impression of somebody for years and years, and suddenly it'll just come out of me. It's like, oh, I thought I would have had to re-practice that, but it's like it turns on some computer in your head. They didn't even know who I was doing, but it was a Halloween radio spot or something. just late last year, and so I did Vincent Price, from Michael Jackson's Thriller. Darkness falls across the land. The midnight hour is close at hand. And they said, "Oh, we've heard that voice before." And I said, "Yeah, it's just some spooky voice." I didn't want to say Vincent Price. We had limited time, and I didn't want to tell him to go, check out The House of Wax or one of his great horror films. But
you mentioned in your earlier years you reached out to all your idols. What has been the most valuable lesson?
I would say without a doubt that it might be the zaniest and funniest thing in the world, especially when you've got more than 30 seconds. I did about 25 years of the Yoram Gross Studios cartoons here, like Blinky Bill and all those cartoons that you probably saw as kids.
Flip and Lepaka.
Yep, exactly.
I love that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I was all the villains in all of those things. And the best thing I learned from the guys who were the ones I called the masters was that, how you often hear people outside the industry who say, "Oh, I can do a funny voice." Funny voice is just twisting their throat like that, which anyone can do, or they're the funny guy at the pub who thinks they can do voiceovers because it sounds like a fun thing. And what, you mean you just go in for, a session for half an hour and that's a living, that thing. But no, they said never fall for that thing of it's just twisting your voice. They said, what you're being asked to do is really an offshoot of stage training and acting. So every role you get, whether it's just a quickie commercial or a half-hour cartoon with several characters interacting where you're talking to yourself in different voices. Yeah, sure, as funny voices as you can come up with, but it's the acting that separates the pros from the amateurs, and getting the meaning of those words across to the absolute degree, or if you're building a character, it does have all those things that Eddie was talking about to his students about, how quick does somebody talk compared to a slow talking person, or how much education have they had compared to another character who hasn't had as much, so that they become almost flesh and blood just with a few pen strokes. It's similar to a newspaper cartoonist, and you do a caricature, but it's got to be accurate at the same time, and that involves the skill of interpretation and the performance. You've got to really become a character. And just for those few seconds that you're doing the thing, I've always found that I've had this ability to become that character in my mind for the few seconds I'm doing it. I can see a picture in my head as I'm doing it of a little stout guy who's a very officious sort of a person, very dismissive and very nasty sort of nature, but it suddenly becomes a character because it's based on a few things about people that you may not like, but the minute you do that, it gets a laugh anyway because everyone recognizes those flaws or those faults in people, and if it's well written, that's the cream on top, if you've got a funny script as well. There have been times where radio voices are king, as you say, the announcers, they used to say the ballsy announcer. Now there's far more a mix of the genders doing the voices, because for a long time they used to have this thing about, this is no offense to you, Rachel, but it goes back to show how society has changed. I can remember in the 70s they'd say, "Oh, we don't have many women, except for if they're a funny character voice. We don't have many women reading voiceovers because there's an irritating factor in their pitch of their voice." So can you imagine them saying that now without being dragged before the Human Rights Commission or something? Because they used to go by these old-fashioned things. Now I'd say that percentage-wise it's at least 50-50, and there's a very generous sharing of all the jobs now with both men and women, which I think is much healthier. You'd also get, for a little while, the guys who had that old John Law's voice, which was the style in those days. It was like, yes, it was one of those very, classic-sounding announcers like that. Now you get the ones who everyone in the world copied Don LaFontaine in America in the late 80s, early 90s, when he invented that whole thing of in a world,
It's so great.
We'll get to that later. Trust me, Rachel's got a final
I've got a
question
good one for you
in
for that.
regard to
Oh, okay, great.
It's funny you mentioned John Lewis because I used to actually produce for him, and work with him in Sydney. So small world, this little radio industry of ours.
He was always a little dismissive of my impersonation of him. I don't sound like that.
Trust me, he does.
Hey, Rach, you didn't even know this. I can do In a World. Do you know that?
Yeah, go for it.
In a world, from a time, from a place far away. Never been booked for that. Feel like I could do it. I practice that. See, there you go, Keith. That's something I've practiced. I'll never get booked for that, but who cares? I love doing it. It's so much fun.
Well, it's not so much doing it accurately, because a lot of people just adopted that getting close to the mic and breathing sort of voice, which I call it. If they do it badly, it's almost like a constipation thing, But mostly it was that smooth voice he had, and the strange thing was he was really a producer. And he became the most used voice in the world there for a while on all those movie promos and theatrical trailers. And really everyone kind of copied. So now it's become not only for films, but every TV station now has, every free-to-air station now has a voice of that station, like Matt Wills, who does that sort of thing for Seven, that sort of voice. And it's morphed into a new type of read. So there are all these changes that have just happened really gradually in the industry. I never really did that much straight stuff, but I was always okay to do just if it was like an audio-visual thing or a corporate thing, just a regular voice like this. If they wanted it stylized, like the voice of God, I was also able to do Orson Welles, or one of those famous actors who had a voice of God, that sort of thing. So you could do all sorts of imaginative things just with the more I listened to things and built up this enormous range of things, the more often I'd be able to pull one of those things out and just give them something unusual. Again, that's another thing. They say, my God, we weren't even expecting that, but it went to air and it worked. And that would then keep you kind of front of mind in the producers' minds. And now, of course, it's a much smaller slice of the pie for me as I've got older, because the industry has just grown. I think the internet had a lot to do with that, because until that happened, you would meet a lot of people who said, gee, I would have liked to have done voiceover work, but it was always just a fantasy of mine, and I just had a regular job. Once the internet happened, you'd get people, and especially with the tools and things that they now have, like sharing and doing all this stuff instantly. I'm not talking about artificial plagiarism or whatever it's called, but the advent of the internet meant that so many people who didn't have a voice before, I'm talking about a voice of being able to communicate, suddenly could. That's where you get the good side of the internet and the bad side, with all of the nastiness out there that was probably dormant in nasty people anyway. But so all these changes have just been really interesting for an old timer like me to watch, because each one of them's been a gradual thing that's taken about 5 years to come to full fruition, But you are right, really, when you say that a lot of that style of voices and the chance to be versatile just isn't being tapped much anymore.
No. Well, I mean, I think, from my point of view, voiceovers has fashion, so things sort of come in and out of fashion. And I think at the moment, I feel like we're just coming out of the storytelling type scripts where, it's an everyday bloke who's telling me a story, trying to engage me in 80 words, 30 seconds. And I think now I honestly feel like we're probably moving to a really mature type of retail sort of thing. Now we want to still hit the audience between the eyes, but not kind of like 20% off, get in right now. There's none of that. But I mean, the outliers are like your Audi commercials and things like that, who are very, very
it's punchy.
Well, they are. What they are is they're willing to take a risk and take a gamble on their advertising, whereas, their competitors in Coles and Woolworths, you listen to those ads and they are 100% retail, boring as can be. And so that's where Aldi's positioned them, very formulaic. And I think...
well, Aldi also, without telling people or even maybe the client, they're just an agency that's very aware of the power of radio. And as we've been saying for a long time, that wasn't used. And I think it's bringing it back now because of the advent of podcasts. It's like they used to say when TV came in and TV was around for decades, the younger generations have lost the art of being able to listen like they did with old-time radio. Now it's come back and the people are listening again, And one of the best things about things like Facebook and that is where they used to bemoan the fact that young people have lost the art of being able to write even a simple letter to someone. At least they're writing now every day on the internet, and that skill is coming back too. Some very creative young folks out there are now able to use those computer tools and all that, and that's where you see these made for YouTube videos and things that just knock your socks off. Sometimes you think, boy, the talent that is out there and that's untapped, and some of them are just happy to do it as a hobby thing. They don't even want to be in showbiz,
Have you been a part of any conventions like Comic-Con where you've been able to reach out and connect with fans of your work?
Well, funny you should ask that, Rachel, because just this last 12 months, even though I'd known a ton of the people who went to Comic-Con, simply because of the distance, I was able to make a trip to LA last July because I was invited, if you're going to be in town, and I thought, boy, getting a bit older, so I did my first ever Comic-Con, and because I'd done those two movies that are now kind of known by some of the folks who grew up with it, like the George of the Jungle movie, I was the narrator in that, so and the Rocky and Bullwinkle movie, because they were all done originally as TV cartoons by the same owners, it's given me a little cachet there, like, if you're the voice of the Looney Tunes, which I was here in this country and stuff like that, and I was the replacement voice in this part of the world for all the Hanna-Barbera characters. So over a long period of, say, 30 years, I've joined that group in the States who now are called voice matches, where you've got to recreate an old character because the original person who did it is now no longer living. And it's got to be because of some of the, I suppose the comic book types, what do they call them, nerds or that? You've got to be pretty accurate because their knowledge is scary.
Yeah, I'm sitting next to one right now. Yeah,
no, we love our nerds. I'm one myself. I'm a real geek. But so I invited to the Comic-Con last July, and I was on two panels: the big famous annual voiceover panel, and the one in the afternoon, which plugged my book, and I was able to do a ton of voices while I was talking about that. But there were all these fans there of the old, Yogi Bear and Daffy Ducks, and so I was able to demonstrate all of those voices too, Yosemite Sam, you long-eared varmint, all that stuff. And of course, Rocky and Bullwinkle, which was, a love of mine. It was the first ever, it was 30 years before The Simpsons. It was the first ever satirical cartoon that I used to be frustrated when I used to love it as a kid because it was a cartoon and it had an adventure component. But I used to get jealous that my mother might be in the same room doing the ironing and she'd be laughing at some of the gags that I didn't get then. And I knew when I got older, I'd get them. So it was a series that worked on 3 levels of age groups. And, it was full of deliberately bad puns. You'd see one episode where Rocky and Bullwinkle were being chased by a giant snowball that was getting bigger and bigger, and the narrator would say, tune into our next episode, avalanche is better than none, or snow's your old man. Really deliberately bad puns, but it was just like, I knew the guy who wrote them, and he said, listen, if people groan at that, that's sensational.
In the ventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle, you worked with the late legendary June Foray, who voices Rocky. What was it like working with one of the best voiceover actors in history?
Well, it was a dream come true. But the thing is, I had written to her when I was, I guess I was like 19, and had a letter back from her. So she knew me when I first ever went to Hollywood in 73 and met them all as a fan, as a person. I'd only been in the business in this country for about 5 minutes. And so I was in the business getting a couple of jobs here and there, but I was able to go and see these masters, as I call them. And so she knew me for years. And then she eventually got a copy of a demo I did when some of these old voices passed away, who Bullwinkle and all the voices. And she played it to her agent. Because she said it was really authentic or accurate or whatever the word was. And the agent called me up while I was in there and said, I'm just across the street from where you're staying. I'd like to represent you here in America. So it was like this, my head exploded. It was like, this just happened because I made a cassette up to give to June Foray and just say, here's some memories for you. And it's like things that happen like that are just like, well, it's the old, there was an angel looking over me that day, put it that way. But no, she was great all the way to the end of her life. She was feisty and brilliant. And she started in the old-time radio field. That's where she created half of these character voices.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free. And you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
That ended up in animation.
And in another interview, you mentioned that June Foray put you in touch with Corey Burton, who you became pen pals with. Are you still in contact? And was it a cool moment for both of your careers when you both landed Brendan Fraser narration movies?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No. I mean, Corey was the only other guy. She met him at the same time as she got my letter, and she said, "I can't believe this coincidence, but there's a guy like you, maybe a year younger than you." And she said he's also fascinated by all the voices we did in these Jay Ward cartoons, like Bullwinkle and that. And so we started writing letters to each other and living the dream that we might end up being able to work in the voiceover industry. We knew we wanted to do it, even while he was in his last year of high school and I just left school, So yeah, she put us together, and yes, while I was over there last year, I still went over to see Corey and had dinner with him, and it was like this almost, God, it's so scary now. It's almost like 50 years I've known him, and you keep forgetting about the fact that you're old guys because you'll bring up some topic or something and start talking on that for hours and hours about some movie voice that's come along that is a good one to imitate, or a politician or whatever it is. I think we were doing dueling Joe Bidens last time,
Okay.
You and Corey have taken the reins on many voiceover roles that were originally voiced by industry titans who sadly passed away or retired. How do you find that task, and how do you make your characters like Bullwinkle your own?
Well, I was really lucky knowing the original people, and so did Corey. In fact, when we were young, they used to take us, if I was in town, to watch them perform a recording session. So they were still doing it even though we'd grown up with their most famous roles, and watching them in a studio was really educational too, because it might be, as I said, a 30-second spot and not an immortal cartoon that they created, and yet they gave it just as much energy and just as much enthusiasm as if it was the first time they'd ever done a voiceover in their lives. And even that sort of dedication was a real thing to take note of. It's like it's almost like it was a weird thing watching these guys who'd been actors for half a century. It almost had that thing about, gee, this might be the last job I ever get. I'll really have to impress this producer. They didn't have to do it, of course, because they were legends, but there was still that thing in them, that it was like that fascination that we all still carry in. Like even when I walk into a session today, I still love the industry and still have that excited feeling. I'm walking into a studio, So I kind of resent in one sense the fact that society has made us all move to home studio setups, even though I don't have one. I still love going to the old-fashioned, standalone recording studio and the whole discipline of it all.
Where did I send you? Where did you go when we did that job?
I went to. There's a girl in Sydney who I've known for years. She did a lot of the Yoram Gross cartoons with me, called Sarah Aubrey, and she's got a home studio, and she's very good at operating it. And over the years, she's eventually ended up with a world class. Well, it's got to be world class, I guess, these days, because you're doing international jobs here and there. But no, she's got a great setup. We're old mates. Yeah, yeah. She said anytime you want.
One of your most famous roles is Bullwinkle and the narrator in The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle. During the shoot, did you record your lines and was it like, okay, cool, see you guys at the premiere? Or did you get the opportunity to collaborate more with the cast and they can react to you?
Yeah, I collaborated, all right, because part of the whole thing was, yes, you pre-record everything so that they've got the timing because it was going to be CGI characters that wouldn't be ready and animated for another 10 months. So you had to, I think that's why I not only did that, but I traveled with the movie for the whole 6 months of the shoot. Now, the reason they asked me to do that was that maybe 3 years before was the first time that ever happened with a comic over there called Charles Fleischer, who was the voice of Roger Rabbit, if you remember. That was a groundbreaking combination of live action and animation in a big budget movie. And he was the first one ever called on to be on the set to do the voice, rather than having, in the old days, they'd have a script assistant or somebody read the lines just for timing. They found it was much more energizing to have the full character voice coming out while the live actors were on the set, and they could react to it the way they would if the animation was seen by the audience months later. But so I did Bullwinkle. I did the usual Hollywood thing where you audition. Well, you audition everywhere, and they, the owners of the characters knew that I had this long relationship with June Foray and her agent Don Pitts over there, and so they wanted me for this thing. But the contract was I was traveling with that movie, and the shoot ended up taking 6 months, so it was like living over there. And even on days where it was mostly out on some weird location, I'd go with them just to. If the actors had to do a running scene or something like that, I had to read the 5-second line by the narrator. And so Boris and Natasha dashed off. And I remember when Jason Alexander was in that movie, and he just burst into laughter when the first time I did it, because he said, "You mean," he said, "they schlepped you 200 miles up here just to stand there for 5 seconds and read that line?" So it was a real experience. And of course, you look back now and I think, I probably lost a bit of work back in Australia for a couple of years because I was away for so long. You know what it's like. If you're not around, they're going to get somebody else. That's the way the industry works. But when I look back at the experience of doing this Hollywood movie and meeting Robert De Niro and all these people, would I have not done it? No way. I'm so glad I got to do that. It was, and the weird thing was that when I did George of the Jungle, that had a temporary track that the director had done because it was pure narration. That was 3 years before Bullwinkle, and they flew me over there to do this for Disney. And that was weird because they put me up being Disney just for 2 days of the recording. They put me up at this really posh hotel in West Hollywood and got a limo. I got driven by a limo to Burbank to the Disney studio. And when I got back to Australia, I told Jim Pike, I said, I got a limo every day to the voiceover. And he went, yes, as if revenge for the anonymity.
Yeah. So good. I've got a couple of little challenges for you. So I know you love doing impersonations and seeing people's eyes light up when they hear your favorite characters, and you're known as the man of 1,000 voices. So I'm going to call out a studio, celebrity, animal or franchise and put you on the spot to do an impersonation, and I will try and match you.
Okay. All right. This will be fun.
All
Game
right.
on, Keith.
I have no idea what you're going to ask for.
Okay, so Disney.
Well, I could do Goofy. Oh, the world owes me a living. or Donald. I can do Donald Duck sneezing.
I'm still child. Mulholland's family.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that is very good. Yeah, the other Disney thing, if you've ever been to Disneyland.
I have in Paris. It's fantastic.
All right. The Haunted Mansion voice.
When hinges creak in doorless chambers and strange and frightening sounds echo through the halls.
I can do a bit of Plumette from Beauty and the Beast, the feather duster.
Ah, right.
Oh,
You guys are great.
Animal?
Yes.
let me. Any type of animal?
Any animal.
Oh, okay. Who would I do for that? Maybe I could do a very wise old owl, and I might do him as Sir Alec Guinness in the very first Obi-Wan Kenobi. So that would be one that I'd choose.
I don't even think that's a voiceover.
Oh, you're talking animal sounds. Oh, animal sounds. Let's see. You
know what a cat that I can do?
It's the same same placement as Donald Duck.
So Simpsons.
Well, the only one that I've ever tried to do is Homer Simpson, so, no, I don't know if that's what you want.
That's quite good. Oh, Richie. How? I'm Scratchy.
Oh, it's in Scratchy.
Right.
That's very good.
Excellent. That's very good.
Thank you. Come again. There you go.
And it's like Rod and Todd. I got the joy down in my heart. Work down in my heart. Work down in my heart. And if the devil doesn't like it, he can sit on attack. Ow! Sit on attack. Ouch!
That's great. You know, this is probably the last bastion to do all these crazy voices.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
It's
Well, it'll be
fun.
pinged for copyright infringement and the podcast will be taken down, but apart from that, it'll be fine.
It'll be all good.
Yeah.
Star Wars. You did
Oh, well,
one
I've
before.
already done that, haven't I? Oh, I tell you what I could do is Darth Vader.
Yes.
Where are those transmissions you intercepted? What have you done with those plans? I've got
Chef's
asthma,
kiss.
Luke.
It's the helmet.
This year, Jar Jar Binks, I am the worst voice actor in the whole Star Wars franchise.
Still sounds good to me.
DreamWorks Studios.
DreamWorks was the first one I ever did for them, was a stage production when the first Shrek movie came out. And so I had to do Donkey. You know, you're a mean green fat machine. Together we're going to scare the spit out of anybody that crosses us, Shrek.
Fire up the ovens, Muffin Man. We got a big order to fill. It's alive.
That's great. Bringing back memories to me.
And lastly, a celebrity of your choosing.
Well, I think the biggest one in the news at the moment is either Donald Trump because of the upcoming election with those hand movements. I'm still going to be tremendous.
And now that they're saying that they're doing a musical on Broadway, I was thinking, wouldn't it be funny if Trump was singing about his own problems, like displaced again, disgraced again, a trial with denial faced again, impeached, cited and indicted am I.
I'm going to keep with politics. I'm going to do Julia Gillard.
Oh,
I
great.
will not be lectured about misogyny by this man.
God, I don't know about that one.
And then imagine Tony Abbott saying, look, I'm not misogynistic, but I just think if two men were to get married, who would do their ironing for them?
You have knocked it out of the park. You've kicked my ass. Like, well done, Keith Scott.
Obviously, well done. Brilliant work.
Thank
Brilliant.
To end this podcast, we've got a challenge for you, which we have for all our guests. So we think this one's in particular is right up your alley. You're exceptional when it comes to narration. And you know the whole inner world trailer narration voice. So, well, our challenge is for you today to do a trailer narration on this whole interview.
Oh, all right.
In a universe called This Is My Voice, we would like to interview everyone who has ever spoken on the planet and have them all banked up so that we can generate their voice in some new version of artificial intelligence.
I don't know if that's got anything to do with this, but
That was brilliant. That was brilliant. Well done, Keith.
Perfect.
Amazing. Well, there you go.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us today. We really appreciate your time.
That's my pleasure. And did you have one final question there, Eddie? We might be able to slot it in. It was not nearly as fun as what Rachel was just doing then, I'm afraid. But I was just going to say, because of your huge and rich career so far, what if you were sitting there talking to 15-year-old, 20-year-old person who wanted to get into voiceovers, what would be a piece of advice you would give them? A little nugget. My advice, it might be hard for them to interpret these days, because we've already talked about how a lot of the styles of voices aren't on call anymore. But I would say if you're really going to do it, listen to everything in showbiz and on the news that you can, and listen with a really, not a critical ear, but just keep your ear open so that you're getting all the range of the human voice in your brain. And also, if you've got that dedication that you really need to keep it's a difficult industry because so many people want to do it. So there's only a finite amount of work around. And so if you want to get work, versatility is the key. So if you're interested, practice as many accents, and funny voices and impersonations and things if you've got that ability. Because you never know, the circle keeps turning and some of those styles may come back into vogue. They're not in vogue at the moment. Sorry. But, and also just read out loud a lot so that your own vocal resonance and all of that develops, and the elasticity that everyone's voice is capable of. Maybe even take a couple of acting courses or singing courses or anything that can expand your knowledge about performance.
Lovely. Thank you, Keith.
I'm going to have a sip.
Yeah, I think so.
You've earned it.
Well, I just started fogging up right at the end, so that's fortunate.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so very much, Keith. That was absolutely brilliant.
Thanks so much.
You're both exceptional hosts, and I love the questions, and it's great to be on the podcast. I do appreciate being asked very much. Sometimes I feel like a relic in this business now, so maybe I can be the Yoda in this whole podcast thing of yours.
Good, he was. Shucks. Was he good? He was.
Oh, well, it's a pleasure having you on the show. We feel very lucky. Rachel. And for the record, like I've grown up watching so many of your shows, and I'm just like, I'm nerding out. We have to get this man as a guest. So it wasn't even a question. We're just like, I'm not saying this to brown nose. We're like, we've got to get Keith.
Thank you very much. It's a weird feeling to get to your senior years and know that in this country you're probably best known as Flap the Platypus on Blinky Bill. So.
Thanks, Keith.
Thanks, Keith.
Thanks, ladies and gents. Thank you very much, and we'll talk in the future. Thank you kindly.
But thank you very much. We'll chat soon, my friend.
Thank you, and either, that's all, folks.
Thank you for listening to This Is My Voice, the podcast about all things voice performance with the world's best voice artists. If you like what you heard, feel free to leave a review and don't forget to subscribe. This episode has been brought to you by the Australian Radio School and delivered to your ears by the Ozcast Network.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.